Hello, welcome back to another episode of Mums on a Mission. I am your host, Julie Hatch, and we're going to have a great episode today. I have another guest that I am talking with today. Her name is Tara O'Brien, and I'm going to read you her bio because it is fascinating. Tara O'Brien is on a mission to help people reclaim their confidence and feel empowered when living with or loving someone with ADHD so that they can live happier, more fulfilled, drama-free lives. Tara's mission began at a low point in her own journey with a simple question: am I part of the problem? She quickly realized that how she showed up in her home directly impacted how her husband, children, and students in her classroom responded, as well as directly affected her own happiness. As she transformed her life from chaos and crises to calm and joyful, she started sharing the process with others in the same situation. Tara realized that she had the key to supporting people who love someone who is neurodivergent. She now shares her journey and methodology so that anyone can start on the path to being drama-free. That's a great intro, Tara. That's really inspiring. Boy, what a journey you've been on, I would say. So welcome. Thank you for being here, Tara O'Brien. Here you are.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. I'm so glad to have you here. And I'm sure all the listeners are going to be fascinated with what you have to say. So before we dive into questions, as I had mentioned, I am going to just let you know that one of my earlier shows, I interviewed my son, who is now 27, who has ADHD. And he went through his whole life. I didn't agree with medicating him because he wasn't that bad off, I didn't think. And so then he has subsequently medicated himself. He's got himself on it. And to hear him talk about the difference between because I'm largely against medicating kids. But when he said the difference between medication and non-medication, it's like night and day, and it's made a huge difference in his life. So I swallowed my pride, I swallowed deep, and I said, wow, well, that's a kid that needed medication for ADHD. But anyway, so that was a conversation with somebody who has ADHD. And I think that what we're going to talk about is you're talking about people around you who have ADHD, your family, your husband and kids.
Husband and kids, yeah. So I am married to a wonderful man who got diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. And we've been together 19 years. And I can tell you it's been an interesting journey to navigate normal life's ups and downs, but with somebody whose brain doesn't work the same way that mine does.
Yeah.
And then we have a delightful son who has an ADHD diagnosis, and he has a gifted diagnosis. So he falls into the twice exceptional category.
Wow.
Which is a whole other ball game.
Wow.
And I have a daughter who has struggled with anxiety.
Yeah.
So we have a wonderful, complex home.
No wonder you have found a way to survive all this with your methods and your tools.
I had to, yeah.
That's very cool. Can you explain what the term neurodivergent means or refers to?
Yeah, so neurodivergent has become a larger umbrella term for people who have thinking processes or neurobiological disorders isn't the right word, but differences in their brain that are not quote unquote typical. So I am a neurotypical person. My executive functioning levels are as would be expected. My reading, my writing, how I see numbers, all of those components fall into what a psychiatrist or neurobiologist would call typical or normal. Right. And when you fall outside that range, you are considered neurodivergent. So it's a larger bucket for people who go through the world with their brain wiring and chemistry different than what like the textbooks would say. Okay.
Do you think that those are happening more often, whether it's more diagnoses or more people being diagnosed with issues that are not, I don't want to use the word normal, but
but we know what we have, and normal is an interesting word, right? And we can talk about that too. It's what we understood. I think, I spent almost 20 years in schools, and what I have noticed is that there was an increase in the diagnoses component of ADHD. I don't think that there are more people who have it. I think we're better at understanding it, recognizing it, and putting structure around it.
Okay.
And so that I don't think all of a sudden it's like, how did we get 6 million people with ADHD? It never existed before. It's always been around.
Yeah. Okay.
We
That
just
makes
didn't know
sense.
what it was.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that
Yeah.
makes sense. Okay. So you have a method, I believe, the OBrien method. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that? Explain. Well, obviously we can sort of get a sense as to how it came about or why it came about, but can you talk about the method a little bit?
Yeah. So my method has 3 components to it. It's got awareness, and it's got vision, and it's got empowerment. Those are the 3 pillars. And the way it came about was I was, again, married to someone who had ADHD, and I have a son who has it. And most of the time we were always in this like problem solving mode, right? That something would happen and we would fix it. And something would happen and we'd fix it again. And we were like layering systems upon systems or having conversations, and we weren't really making a whole lot of traction, and we were getting really frustrated. He was frustrated, I was frustrated, right? Like the emotional level in the home was just incredibly high.
Yeah.
And I was always waiting for the next thing to go wrong.
Shoot a drop. Yeah.
Shoot a drop. And it was exhausting. It was emotionally draining. And that piece of like, am I the problem? Am I part of the problem? Really came about because I was like running around like crazy. I was, making lists, and this was, pre-cell phone, pre-technology, not pre-cell phone, but pre-smartphone days. So it was like calendars and lists and sticky notes and reminders and phone calls. And I was like, wait a minute, like, is this actually helping? Am I making things worse? And when I talked with my husband in particular, the answer was yes.
Oh, wow.
So like here I was thinking I was doing all of this great stuff, right? Like, I mean, how could he possibly be upset for all of the things I was doing for him? And that was the problem, is it was infantilizing. It was frustrating to him. It was making him feel like our relationship was not husband and wife, but, mother and child, which I didn't want to be, right? And we had, especially once we had a child, it felt like I was treating my actual child the same way I was treating my husband. And it was like, it was unhealthy. And so we had to stop and say, what is going on? And I was like, I'm part of this problem because I don't really understand ADHD. I don't really understand what's going on with me and why the dynamic between the two of us isn't working, even though we have all these conversations and we're so, in it together.
Yeah.
And why are like all these tools not working, right? Like, so what we did, and it's taken, refined over the last 15 years, but we start with a vision. And vision and awareness come together. But really what we have found is that if you don't know what kind of life you want to live, if you don't know how you want breakfast to go, if you don't know how you want the birthday party to be handled, right? If you don't sort of have a vision, then you're always in responding to crisis.
Sure.
You're always reacting rather than being proactive.
Yeah.
And so if you can start creating a vision of like, hey, this is how I want mornings to go. And why do I want them to go this way? Right. And getting really grounded in your values. Like, I don't want yelling because this is what it feels like. Then all of a sudden you have something to aim for. It's not this like arbitrary, like, oh, I just didn't like it. I'm mad at you because you didn't turn the coffee on in the morning and you should have known better. Right. It starts to remove the shoulds.
Yeah.
And then the next component of that, so sort of linked together, is this awareness component. So I need to be aware of what's going on in my home. But what I found out first is I have to be aware of how I show up to situations. And I spent a lot of time initially working on my own mindset, what triggered me and why, what was really important. Why did it bother me that my husband lost his keys? Or whatever it was, right? Why does it bother me that my son leaves his shoes in the middle of the hallway? So that I didn't just come in and start yelling, right?
Yep.
Like, and now we're in a power struggle over something that really was undiscovered, right? So like, you had to be sort of sit with yourself. And what leads into that is that we had a whole slew of these hidden social contracts in our life, which is really the fancy way of saying inadvertent expectations,
Yeah, sure.
right?
I think
So
that's
when those
normal.
aren't articulated,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
this poor person, are constantly bumping up against my walls
yeah,
because I've thrown out all these roadblocks and expectations over what I think are seemingly simple things like, hey, go clean your room, or could you get ready for dinner? Like, to my children with ADHD and anxiety, those are loaded statements
yeah,
and just constant places for them to fail
yeah,
and get in trouble
yeah.
and not do it right. And I didn't really have any idea. They seem so simple, right? Like, get ready for dinner. Isn't that obvious? Like, go get ready for dinner. And it's not obvious at all. In fact, I have a funny story around that. We had a whole thing around dinner. And this is my daughter. You do either one, but like, I love we have a goal in our home that you're not constantly on screen. So my daughter was painting in her room. We have all these protocols around arts and crafts, right? You have to clean up when you're done. But I had also set up a whole paradigm of like, when I call you for dinner, you need to come, like, the first time. So she was in the middle of painting. I yelled down the hallway and said, dinner's ready. And she stood there and she didn't know what to do. And all of a sudden she just started screaming. And so I was like, what's going on? And she's like, I can't win, because if I take the time to clean up the paints, I'm late to dinner. But if I go to dinner and don't clean up the paints, you're going to take my paints away from me. And I was like, had this moment of like, oh, that's on me. Like, that's not on her. That's not her fault. Like, that's on me. I totally set her up for failure. So being able to examine those components and really get clear on like how to help them navigate those pieces were a big part of awareness. And then the tools piece, the empowerment, actually comes pretty easy after that. Because once you know what you want, you know what's going on, right? Where you're at, where your kids are at, where your husband's at, wherever, then the tools sort of naturally fall into place.
Okay.
Because they're all aligned with what deep understanding you have, the communication style you have. They allow you to be flexible and adaptable. And so this methodology has come out of those components of lots of trial and error.
Yeah.
And
but you've lived it. You've lived it. So so it's really, I say, good for you for being that insightful. For you, for one thing, saying, whoa, is it me, or what can I do to change it? That's, for one thing, huge. And and then it strikes you that maybe, do you feel like you are the one that is having to be more understanding of others and more flexible and more, not giving, but just more flexible?
It did initially, and I think it can be viewed that way. I think moms, a lot of time in general, carry the executive and emotional load of their home, right? Where, at least in my working with moms, we tend to know the family calendar, right? We're the one that's baking for the bake sale, watching for homework, prepping for soccer games, even if you have a great shared partnership with your other partner, right? Yep. But there's also societal pressure of like, moms are supposed to be this thing, right? This all-knowing, omnipresent thing. Yeah. And so that piece around like, it's on me to be the most flexible is both yes and no. So it's flexibility in the sense that as somebody who has the ability to have high levels of executive functioning, who is able to emotionally regulate, right? Like, I have these skills. Yeah. So it's not a burden to use them. I did go through a period where it's like, why does it always fall on me? Like, I always have to. And then I was like, well, wait a minute. Thank goodness that I have these skills. And if they had them, they'd use them. Right. So you can't blame them, certainly. You can't blame them. And I can model. Yeah. One of the things we learned to do very early on was that, like, I actually started narrating a lot of my life. So that those who in my home didn't have this ability could see, gosh, this is what happens. Right? Like, oh, we need to leave for the airport, or there's a soccer game at 6:30. Well, it takes 20 minutes to get there. So we want to leave by 6, which means we need to, right? And I could back those pieces all the way out. Because to them, it was like, well, the game's at 6:30, we'll leave at 6:30, right? Like, that's the only time they knew. So did that make sense to them when you did that? It does. And this is where executive functioning is taught. We learn a lot of innate skills just through like growing up in society.
Right.
Executive functioning is one of these sets of skills. So things like working memory, task activation, emotional regulation, self-awareness, those pieces that have to be explicitly taught.
Yeah.
And it's mostly taught through modeling.
Okay.
And so and when you have somebody who is neurodivergent, who falls into, the ADHD realm, they're already at slight deficit in this place.
Yeah.
Many of them have a 3-year delay in the connection to the prefrontal cortex, which is where a lot of this executive functioning sits.
3-year delay.
3-year delay. So your 12-year-old could have an executive functioning level of a 9-year-old.
Yeah.
Right. That's a big difference.
It makes sense. I can see that. Yeah.
So your 7-year-old at a 4-year-old. So you think you hit this moment where you're like, well, my kid should be able to do something,
but
they can't. And it's a not yet situation.
Right.
So yeah, you do sit there. So I used to think it was a frustrating, like, why do I always have to bend and flex? And now I see it as this is a superpower. I can bend and flex.
Yeah.
And because we've simplified things, because we've cleared out the expectations, because things are grounded in what we want and value, because we communicate about it.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like you're giving up. You're like, oh, we need to just pivot slightly.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay.
That's great. What a great story. Makes me wonder though, what if you had ADHD? What would your household be like?
Probably a little more chaotic. And some of the families I work with do have that, right? Like, what do you do when the adult has ADHD or both parents have ADHD?
Yeah.
The process is exactly the same. You have to start first with, well, what do you want your home to look like? Or what do you want this specific moment to look like? And people with ADHD can do that. It's just not knowing where to start. We often default to like, well, this is what I want. And it's relatively unexamined. Or we know we don't want this to happen. So we try to put systems in place. But if the systems aren't fully thought out, they start to fail. And then we get frustrated and then we get fatigued. Because we're like, well, why bother to try something new? Nothing ever works.
Yeah. Did your husband have ADHD as a kid? I feel like that's a dumb question. I think, of course he did, but was he just not diagnosed until he was an adult? Or I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, exactly what happened.
You don't develop ADHD with age, do you?
No. If anything, there's a small portion that I don't want to say grows out of it, but learns to cope well enough that it's not as impactful. So looking back on his childhood, he very much talks about how he was just misdiagnosed and how he was able to find a few coping structures that allowed him to get through school without getting in trouble. Right. It really didn't become sort of a big problem where he felt like he needed more structure and support until he got into the workforce, where, having a quick brain with no filter, like didn't go so well with bosses and clients and, we're stressing about deadlines, whether, did he meet them? Could he meet them? Or that hyper focus that happens where you like, well, I spent 6 hours on this. And they're like, yeah, but you didn't do any of your other work. In the meantime. So that's where for him, that frustration, that anxiety of like, I'm supposed to be an adult and I can't seem to hold a job, or I can't find satisfaction within a job, or I'm constantly stressed. I'm always worried about the things going wrong. Really came to the forefront for him.
Yeah. Interesting. I don't know whether to get into this. Is he on medication? Is he or your son on ADHD meds? Or maybe you don't want to answer that. Maybe I'm being too nosy.
I don't know how he would feel. We have looked at medication. My son currently is not being medicated. And part of that is because we have engaged him in the conversation around, is this something that you feel that you need to have at the moment? And I'm fascinated about how you talked with your own child looking back. And I think, I don't have a strong stance on medication. I think it's very different for every family.
Absolutely.
But what I do know is that if systems aren't working, if coping strategies aren't working, if some of the like tricks and hacks aren't working, sometimes you need medication to help slow the brain down enough. Right. So that they can learn the systems. And you don't necessarily have to be medicated forever, but if
Right.
it removes roadblocks and if it allows for like the development to happen,
Yeah.
then it's just another tool in the toolkit. I think
Yeah.
where medication gets tricky in what I've seen is that when it's the only
Right.
tool that's being used.
Yeah, I wish I'd had you around back a long time ago when my kid, well, I have 3 kids, but one of them is really, and their father, my ex-husband, people used to call him the poster child, the Ritalin poster child. He was so ADHD, but I really didn't know much about it. It was really kind of new back 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So
Yeah.
I wish I'd known
And I
more
think that's
about
when
it.
it got put on the DSM-5. I think
Yeah,
that's when it actually became something that like they
right,
looked at it and it wasn't just behavioral, that
right,
there's like
right.
actual like neurobiological differences in the brain. We know that it affects the neurotransmitters. We know that like different parts of the brain are different sizes. Like it's
Yeah.
not about
Them
behavior
acting out
or
because, right, because
yeah,
of just being bad kids.
just
I
being
don't,
bad or
I don't
willful or
believe
they
in
just
that
need
at
to
all.
exercise more. I mean, all those things help,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
but they
yeah.
help any kid. Like,
Yeah, I guess we've really come a long way in a pretty short amount of time, which is
yeah,
great. So tell me, what are some of the biggest mistakes that parents make when it comes to supporting people with ADHD?
so I alluded to it earlier. I think it's where you start with the fix it first.
You
So
okay?
when one of the biggest mistakes parents make is they try to put systems or try to fix the problem
Yep.
without really looking at the underlying driver. So, something like homework not getting done, then we try to, fix it. Either we can hire tutors or we we start putting punishments around things like you
Yeah.
can't have screen time until your homework's done, or we use reward charts. And what's really going on with something like homework could be a whole other slew
Yeah.
of
Oh,
challenges.
yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so when we try to look at like what the behavior is, and we try to fix that without really understanding what the other indicators are.
Right.
And that's the other piece, is looking at the behavior rather than and seeing it as like they're being defiant or they're being disrespectful or they're out of control. Well, not the other mistake parents make is seeing the behavior as something to address rather than behavior as communication.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I'm right with you on that.
So they're telling you that something's up. You
Yep.
just like, that's on us then to listen, right?
Exactly.
And to be curious.
And to be detectives and figure out
Figure it out.
Okay.
And ask lots of questions. And it's surprising that sometimes it's 3, 4, 5, 6 layers deep.
Sure.
And like not even in the same lane.
Yeah. Yeah. Something completely different from what you think it's going to be, or
Yeah. Like there's something that's happening at school and all of a sudden it's because, some kid at the like playground 3 weeks ago or whatever.
Yep.
You just didn't know. And so you're getting really curious. And so I think that's another mistake parents make, is they don't get curious and stay curious long enough.
Yep. They just want to fix it. They just want to punish it or reward it
or yeah.
Fix it.
And it comes from our own fear, right? That's why I say you have to start with yourself.
Yes. Yeah.
Because if you're worried about your kid, the worry is not really about your kid. The worry is your emotion.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the worry is about how you'll look as a parent, or that you'll get pulled out of work, or
yep.
That's you.
So true. So true. Yep. You got to feel good with yourself first. And the person that I talked with yesterday, she was talking about feeding and eating disorders and stuff. Mm-hmm. She was saying the same thing. And I preach this all the time, is that you got to figure out why whatever is going on. And that's the basis of how my parenting coach, you got to figure out why behavior, I think, is challenging behavior. I don't like to use the word bad. Challenging behavior is a call for help. They're trying to communicate, like you said. So I completely understand what you're saying, and I'm sure the listeners can too, because
it's hard in that moment. It's hard when your kid is acting out. It's hard when the meltdown is happening and you're exhausted, to sit there and say, I see you, I hear you, I'm going to sit on the floor next to you, right? When you're like, just Let's go.
Yep. Yep. So that leads to, there was something about yelling that I wanted to ask you about, how there's a lot of yelling that goes along with ADHD and arguing and pushback. And so what are some tips to how to deal with that?
Yelling. I love this. Yelling was because yelling was a big one in our home. And it was actually one of the things I uncovered, that like yelling put me on edge immediately. Right. And one of the things we like needed to clarify, even in our own house, was getting loud versus yelling.
Yeah.
And that they were different. Right. But yelling has this whole component, and it comes from the deep desire to be heard. Right. And
So
when we are not feeling seen and heard, we get bigger and louder. Right. So the tantrum gets bigger, we get louder. And so how do we like de-escalate out of that? Right. Like, how do we make sure we can communicate without yelling? And it's one of those like, okay, well, how do we help people feel seen? And it's quite literally saying, I see you.
Yeah.
I see you're frustrated. I see you're angry with me. I see that, your shoulders are telling me something, right?
Yep.
And when they start talking, rather than respond right away, just sit and hear them.
Yep.
Gosh, it sounds like you're having a tough day. Sounds like, what I hear you saying is that you are super angry with the decision I've just made.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
It doesn't mean I'm going to give in. Doesn't mean that my decision's not going to be the one that stands.
Right. The value of being heard, especially for kids who are not as easily heard as adults, is huge. That message that they're being heard and seen makes them feel like they have some value and that they're worth something in this. I mean, it goes on and on about what being seen and heard can do for a child. And
it takes them out of their amygdala, right? It takes them out of that limbic system.
Yeah.
Right. If they then get to talk about how they're feeling, that language center then moves into the other components of the brain.
Yeah.
Right. Which naturally is going to drop the adrenaline and the cortisol and all of those other hormones that are in that fight, flight, freeze stage.
Yeah.
Right. So it's us taking the time to not get triggered by our kids yelling at us because we've been programmed that that's a sign of disrespect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And to sit there and say, gosh, I really see that you are super upset right now.
Right.
Right. And not matching emotion.
Right.
And there's a component too, like I learned with my kids, they were super sensitive to volume.
Yep.
And I came from a loud, kind of gregarious background. And when we get animated, we get loud and, and
that's fine.
It's fine.
Yeah.
But I had to be careful because my loud got interpreted as yelling. And for a while I'd say, I'm not yelling, I'm just loud. And then I realized that even that clarification wasn't enough because it was so instinctual to them that I needed to figure out how to modulate or regulate my voice. And one of those things, like even the yelling, thinking about the dinner one, like they've asked me not to yell down the hall for dinner.
Yeah. Well, hey, the fact that they even communicate that, and that's an easy fix, right?
It's an easy fix. So I now walk down the hall and knock on their door or, say, hey, dinner, and at first though, it's amazing how those simple requests seem, I was like, what do you mean? That's ridiculous. And I was like, no, my goodness, how great, right? I can do that.
Yep. And it makes them feel a lot better. And it's not, I guess, that big a deal.
Not that big a deal.
It sounds like, I'm sure no household is like Mary Poppins, but it sounds like your house has to be running a whole lot better than it was. What'd you say, 15 years ago?
Yes. So, I mean, if you had like a fly on the wall in our home, right? Like from the minute my feet hit the floor, I had this like, what next? Like, let's just go. I was sort of bracing for whatever was going to come. I felt that I had to hold everything together, that the success or failure of the day fell on me. And that has shifted dramatically. And it's not to say that there aren't days that I'm pulling my kid out of bed or that we don't forget a homework assignment or, I say, hey, could you clean your room? And like, it's magically done. Like,
no.
Nobody. No, I mean, I am raising strong, independent kids and they are going to have their own pushback. I expect them to push back. right? Like I expect them to use their voice. There's lots of communication, but what's happened in the shift, the reason we're no longer in this state of chaos and drama is that everything can be discussed. Like we've set up a place where it's like, here's how we're operating now. And at any point, somebody can call a family meeting and say, I'd like to bring up, bedtime, or I'd like to bring up screen time or whatever. And we can discuss it. And we all put our cards on the table.
Yeah.
And we talk about it. And they know that we have final decision.
Right.
But they do have a voice in the rules that affect them. And they're allowed to ask why.
Yeah. Perfect.
Right.
Good for them.
Yeah. Well, and that was on us because the first time my kid asked why at like 4 or 5 years old, and I gave them the because I said so, I thought, my mother. I just did the very thing that I hated as a kid.
Yeah.
And you know what? He's right.
Yeah.
This does impact him. I should have an answer for him.
Right.
So we came up with answers, and we have had some great conversations. Like my son is really big into video games.
Yeah.
And esports and a whole world of stuff that like this mom is not engaged with, right? I don't game.
Yeah.
Like, Nintendo or Atari was the big thing when I was a kid, right? I'm dating myself, but it's one of those components of like, he was asking, we have screen time. We had at the time bigger screen time limits, and I didn't want him on certain games, and you couldn't be in chat rooms and stuff like that, right? From a safety tech protection component.
Yep.
But what was happening is he was getting involved in games with people at school where his social component was online.
Yeah.
And it was impacting his ability to engage with his friends. And so we had to have a conversation about like, well, we're not just going to do whatever your friends do.
Right.
But clearly this is affecting you. So let's talk about what this all means. And I had to go get educated.
Yeah.
What games do you want to play? What am I willing to have you play? Talk to me about this Discord thing, right? Like, can you lock it down? Is it just strangers? And so he could walk me through like, this is what I would like to do. And I'm like, okay, I feel comfortable with that. We'll try it. Right. So it wasn't an automatic yes. It was like, let's try it and see what happens.
Yeah.
And it shifted everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. For both of us around like, oh, my kid's growing up. He's in a world that I don't fully understand. So I need to go understand it.
Yeah.
Rather than just
shut it out. Right.
Right. Which is where I wanted to be. No, you don't need to be doing that nonsense. No, that's, a waste of time, a waste of money, a waste of blah, blah, right? Like, but it was really important to him.
Sure.
And so it was worth the time to figure it out. And then every couple of years, right, we would go through and have to, or not even every couple of years, like every year, we have to like make sure it's still working.
Safe. And Yep.
And that's where that conflict of expectations also comes in. So he got on a series of games where if you log out of the game mid battle or whatever, they actually kick you off the server. They like lock you out and won't let you play anymore.
Wow.
Because everything's based on like rank. And so what was happening is when people thought they were losing, they would just quit the game. So it affect their score.
Yeah.
So here I was telling him either for dinner or bedtime or something else to get off the game. And he's saying, I can't, I'm in a game. And I'm saying, I don't care, get off.
Interesting. Yep.
Right. And finally it was like, we got to figure this out. Like what's going on? Is it just that you can't start this time, a game before 5 o'clock because, dinner's coming and I had no idea that he was going to lose rank.
Right.
I had no idea that he was playing with his friends. And what I was basically asking him to do was just like hang up and walk away.
Right.
Which I never would encourage him to do from a social aspect.
Yeah.
So again, that piece around like I was creating conflict.
Yeah. Wow.
Right.
And all it took was just understanding, which again, you have the wherewithal to step back and say, okay, what's wrong here?
What's going on? Yeah.
That's great. So Tara, what do? You work with other parents, or can you explain what you do? And if somebody wants to find you, I don't think I have your anyways, can
I'll
you
make sure you
say
have all, yeah.
what your work involves, who you work with, how you work, and how maybe people could get a hold of you?
Yeah, great. So I work with families who are raising kids with ADHD,
Okay.
and it's through one-on-one coaching. Right now, I have some group coaching coming up in the future, but what we've really found is that just like your child is so individualized,
Yeah.
so is your situation.
Yeah.
And that what the goal there is to get you as the parent feeling most confident, most empowered, most aware,
Yep.
so that you, when you're running your home, that it's designed specifically for you, right?
Right.
So to have the express version of what I went through,
Yeah.
right? Sort of in a condensed manner. And that because the parent-child relationship is so important, right?
Oh,
and we
yeah.
don't want to like add in an executive functioning coach or add in somebody to take over those roles. That parent-child relationship is so important, or adult-child relationship is so important.
Right.
So my goal is to help you work on whatever components need to be worked on, in that knowing that it's awareness, vision, or empowerment, somewhere in the three of those pieces.
Yeah. Yep.
Through a series of meetings and Zoom calls. And if people are interested, they can reach me at my website, which is dramafreeadhd.com. And I actually have time set aside in my calendar where I will offer a breakthrough and discovery call. So if they're just curious about like, want to chat for a little bit or see, if this would be a fit, there's a no obligation call with me.
And I get what you do. I, as a parent coach, I get questioned all the time. I think people expect me to work with the kids. And I say, no, I'm not their mother. I'd like to help you solve the problems that are going on. So you don't work with a child, do you? Or maybe
I can.
Yeah, right.
So that's where the customization comes into play, right? So sometimes what ends up happening is that the household is going to dramatically change, right? Like they are deciding they've realized they need a total overhaul. And that can feel a little scary to kids, or the parent doesn't necessarily feel like they've got the language to describe what's happening.
Yeah.
So once we've worked together and we're like, this is a great plan, let me include me in on a family meeting. So that I can answer questions and they know what you're doing, right? That this isn't random and it isn't arbitrary. And then there are some families where I do work with the kid on occasion because they need somebody to ask questions to that understands it, or they are feeling that they can't communicate to their parent effectively and want some help on how can they become their best self-advocate. But the goal still is around that parent-child relationship. Because the parent is going to be there every day and I'm only there once a week.
Right. Wow. But so you're there to guide and to help as they get through the initial change and awareness in those three components that you said. Wow. What a great service. What a great service. So Tara O'Brien's website is dramafreeadhd.com. It's a great, I did know that was a website. It's a great website. So is there anything that we're going to wrap up? Is there I don't think there's anything else that I have in mind to ask you. Do you have anything that you'd like to add to the parents that are listening?
My one, I guess, little takeaway in all of this is that it's never too early and it's never too late to start making shifts in your home. So if you feel like, or in yourself, which manifests in your home, right? Like, so you're thinking, oh, my kid's really small, I don't know what's going on yet. Like, this is about you and how you're showing up for your kid. Or my child's in high school and they're about to leave home. It doesn't, they're still going to be calling you. They're still in your circle, right? It really is never too late. And the repair and the love and the joy will be there. Right. And so it's worth the time to check it out.
It is. What a great service. Because I remember when my kids were little, for one thing, life was too busy to even stop and say, well, what could we be doing differently? But even so, I would also think, oh, we'll get through this and then we'll be into another phase. But it makes so much more sense to just, when some things aren't going right, stop and figure out why and just reset
Yeah.
will then stick with you for the rest of your parenting life, which is forever.
Forever. Absolutely. It's that confidence to know, gosh, this doesn't feel good. We're out of flow.
Yeah.
Let's go back
Yeah.
and see what needs to be tweaked.
Yeah. Great. Well, Tara, thank you so much. This is Tara O'Brien from dramafreeadhd.com. Sounds like a great resource for anybody who has even just a little inkling of, boy, should I wonder if, give her a call or look her up on her website. All right, so that is the end of this episode. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Tara. And I hope to see you next week on my next episode. Thank you.